Hello guys, Promehteus here. This video is the deepest and the most detailed breakdown of the movie Prometheus, where we'll thoroughly explore all the hidden references and symbolism, details, and the deleted scenes. I've probably spent tens of hours going through extra materials about Prometheus, including documentaries, Ridley Scott's commentaries, and interviews. And every scene has layers and layers of deep symbolism and various connections. That's why there's a plethora of hidden and deleted content to discuss, so let's get started. In the opening moments of Prometheus, the camera sweeps across a primordial landscape on what appears to be a newly formed planet. Possibly Earth itself, but Ridley Scott intentionally leaves its identity ambiguous. Then we see a colossal shadow falling over the surface, revealing a disc-shaped alien vessel that hints at its otherworldly origin. In one interview, Ridley Scott mentioned that he wanted the ship to look like a classic UFO as opposed to the famous juggernaut on LV-426. Next comes one of the most fascinating scenes in the movie. A lone, cloaked figure steps towards a waterfall. This figure, an engineer, consumes a mysterious black liquid that causes his body to break down at the genetic level. The merging of the engineer's genetic material with the environment suggests that this sacrifice may be the catalyst for life on Earth. While the theatrical version of the scene implies a brief, ritualistic act, the Blu-ray's deleted footage expands into a full ceremonial sequence. In the extended cut, an elder engineer presents a sacrificial bowl to the chosen engineer, highlighting a solemn and almost priestly hierarchy. This sequence also includes unseen dialogue that appears in the early draft script, which I discussed in my other video. But the important takeaway from the deleted dialogue is that the goldish substance is the blood of the xenomorph-like deity that engineers worshipped. Also, the hieroglyphs etched onto the bowl and the bowl itself later reappear in the temple on LV-223. The sacrificial engineer appears to be the best genetic specimen of their race, likely chosen to ensure the creation of a high-quality life form on the planet. In addition, dozens of engineers stand on the other side of the waterfall right below the ship watching the event. His tall, muscular physique and marble-like features were actually created by blending together classical Greco-Roman sculptures, reinforcing the idea of him being a godlike figure. However, beyond aesthetics, this ceremony resonates with myths of divine beings who sacrifice themselves to create or uplift humanity, a theme echoed in religious narratives like Christ's crucifixion. Ridley Scott subtly underscores these religious parallels throughout Prometheus, weaving Christian symbolism into details like Dr. Shaw's crucifix and the film's broader inquiries into faith. The location of the sacrifice ceremony also has a deep symbolism. Water, almost universally associated with purity, cleansing, and genesis, here becomes the medium through which the engineer's genetic material propagates. This imagery intertwines biblical motives of baptism and rebirth with the film's sci-fi concepts of biogenetic engineering. The black goo that simultaneously destroys and creates life emerges as a central mystery that drives the story forward. Early concepts and the documentary reveal that there were actually a few other versions of that opening scene. In one of them, the engineer's body disintegrates into small insects. One of these insects bites a primitive man, and the camera then zooms in on his dilated pupil, showing the transformation of his DNA. After the film's opening scenes, the movie jumps forward billions of years to the 21st century. During the film's pre-release campaign, the studio produced several promotional materials, most notably the Weyland TED Talk. It's not featured in the theatrical cut, but it provides essential insights into the motivations and the worldview of Peter Weyland, one of the main figures in Prometheus. Weyland's TED Talk took place in February 2023 in the Alien timeline, and he opens by mentioning his favorite film, Lawrence of Arabia. The historical Lawrence was a British officer who fought for Arab independence, renowned for his defiance of authority and disregard of traditional rules. Lawrence's rebellious spirit and vision mirrors Weyland's own ambitions, to push boundaries of what is considered possible and to achieve grand, transformative feats for humanity. In his speech, Weyland then turns to the Greek myth of Prometheus, from which both the movie and the expedition take their name. In ancient lore, the Titan Prometheus defied the gods by stealing fire from Mount Olympus and gifting it to humans. This rebellious act granted humanity knowledge, enabling civilization's rapid progress, yet Prometheus paid a heavy price. Zeus sentenced him to an eternal punishment in which an eagle devoured his liver daily only for it to regenerate each night. This myth resonates deeply within the film's narrative. Just as Prometheus's gift of fire had massive, unforeseen consequences, the Prometheus crew seeks quote-unquote fire in the form of forbidden knowledge about humanity's creators, the engineers. Their quest for answers challenges divine, or in this case, extraterrestrial authority. So in striving for truths that may have been better left undiscovered, the scientists unintentionally unleash horrors that echo the punishment of the Titan Prometheus himself. The parallels also extend to the creation of David, the android serving aboard the Prometheus. By creating an artificial being in their own image, humans effectively usurp a power once reserved for gods only. Weyland then states that the god is dead and that we humans became gods. His declaration that the god is dead references Friedrich Nietzsche, whose main idea in philosophy was that the ultimate goal of an individual is the quest for power, which Weyland takes to the extreme. Nietzsche actually hated religions, and particularly Christianity, that in his view led many people to adopt slave morality and adherence to moral values. And Nietzsche argued that these moral behaviors deterred people from seeking as much power as possible. So it seems like Weyland embodies Nietzsche's philosophy and the rejection of God. Weyland then replaces God with the quest for power, no matter the cost. Weyland's mission to ask the engineer for more life reflects the same hubris. Rather than humbly acknowledging a higher power, Weyland believes mankind has effectively become that higher power. However, the violent encounter between Weyland and the sole surviving engineer on LV-223 underscores the foolishness of such overconfidence. In his final moments, Weyland comes face to face with the very being that he claimed mankind had surpassed, and pays the ultimate price for it. Then, in the year 2089, Dr. Elizabeth Shaw and Charlie Holloway make a huge discovery. In a remote cave on Earth, they find an ancient carving. A dark cave is illuminated only by the beam of Shaw's flashlight. The light piercing the darkness symbolizes their quest to uncover hidden truth about humanity's origins. Amid the cave's mysterious markings, Shaw points to a star map on the wall, a depiction strikingly similar to diagrams found among various ancient cultures across the globe. The star map serves as a catalyst for the entire Prometheus mission. The map suggests that early civilizations not only knew about the engineers, but may have been guided or influenced by them. Shaw's actions in the cave highlight her blend of scientific curiosity and deep-seated faith. This duality is a central theme in the film, as Shaw seeks to reconcile scientific discoveries with her beliefs about creation and God. In addition, there are two alternate versions of that scene that were ultimately not used. One version, which was shut down for financial reasons, involved a submarine expedition where Shaw and Holloway uncovered a sunken city, reminiscent of Atlantis, and discovered a tablet with a star map on it. Another version depicted the discovery of city ruins on Mars, which contained the same star map found on Earth. Before the Prometheus ship departed to LV-223, there are a few events that happened right before the expedition, which are depicted in the Blu-ray promotional materials. There exists a deleted scene with Dr. Shaw's interview message to Weyland-Yutani, where she explains her desire to go to the place depicted on the star maps, where she believes the questions about humanity's origins will be answered. Then there is another deleted scene of this interview being played in a Weyland-Yutani research facility on Mars. But there exists an even crazier version of that scene. Holloway and Shaw visit Weyland on a rotating, self-sustaining space station to pitch their research and ideas to him directly. The scene was ultimately rejected, but there are some concept arts depicting it. In that meeting, Shaw also presented findings from her notebook that describes a black goo urn that she found on Earth, as well as carvings of the space jockey chair, and even the interiors of the Juggernaut ship, suggesting that some ancient humans were allowed inside the engineer's ship. Blu-ray also has a few other promotional videos worth mentioning. One of them is titled Happy Birthday David and provides a detailed description of the advanced model David 8. In that video, David admits that he can carry out directives that his human counterparts might find distressing or unethical. One clip shows him playing with small human figurines, foreshadowing his eventual manipulation of the crew later in the movie. Another video, Prometheus Transmission, features short interviews with each crew member and a compilation of random objects that were possibly taken aboard Prometheus, such as paintings and a dressing table. The video also contains interviews of every character where they describe their motives and objectives in the Prometheus expedition. David states that his mission is to care for the crew, an endeavor at which he ultimately fails. Shaw identifies herself as the expedition leader, signaling her guiding role in the research for humanity's origins. Holloway, on the other hand, proclaims that his intent is to dismantle all man-made religions, seeking definitive proof that would invalidate centuries of spiritual tradition. The video even includes footage of crew members undergoing physical training, emphasizing the rigorous preparation behind such a dangerous and historic mission. Then the film transitions to the Prometheus spacecraft traveling through deep space. Most of the crew, including Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, remains in cryosleep, an induced stasis that slows metabolic processes and preserves both body and mind for long interstellar journeys. Meanwhile, David, the android, remains awake and in control of the ship's operations. Ridley Scott chose to reveal David's artificial nature from the start, diverging from the original Alien of 1979, which kept Ash's identity hidden until much later. But David's role goes beyond mere piloting and maintaining the ship. He also monitors Shaw's dreams via advanced technology like a total creep. This quiet glimpse into Shaw's subconscious mind highlights David's position as both observer and manipulator. In Shaw's dream, we see her as a curious child asking her father about the afterlife, foreshadowing her lifelong quest for answers about existence and faith. Expanded backstory clarifies that Shaw's mother died in childbirth, and her father later succumbed to Ebola virus in Africa. Then we get a closer introduction to David, a synthetic and the keeper of the ship who was awake for 2 years while everybody else was asleep, which is an homage to 2001's Space Odyssey movie. David's introduction also has a few other classic science fiction references. In one scene, David plays basketball while riding a bike, which is a nod to a similar scene with Ripley in Alien Resurrection. He also studies Proto-Indo-European, the language of the engineers, foreshadowing his ability to communicate with them. Another fascinating thing is that the linguist featured on David's projector was the real-life language consultant hired for Prometheus. Then there's a short clip of him watching a movie, Lawrence of Arabia, that was already referenced by David's creator, Peter Weyland. Interestingly, David copies the appearance and the manner of speaking from the main character of that movie, Lawrence, which reflects David's fascination with human behavior and his desire to emulate it. David also recites one of his favorite lines from the movie, and the trick is not minding that it hurts. Ridley actually explained in the commentary that David really gravitated towards Lawrence because he also had soulless quality to him, similar to David, who likely does not have a soul at all. But then follows a really interesting sequence that foreshadows that David will actually be a villain. In a short clip, David is seen drinking milk, which is a common motive associated with villains in cinema. This subtle detail hints at David's darker side, suggesting that his intentions may not align with the well-being of the crew. Milk also references the white fluid that serves as blood for androids in the Alien series. The fact that android fluid is white has really disturbing parallels, but conceptually it makes it look like David is drinking his own blood. There's also a short clip of David crying that was actually deleted from the final cut, hinting at David's ability to experience human emotions. And in that clip, David's tears are not an imitation, he was actually crying while watching the movie alone, with no one to pretend to. As the Prometheus reaches its destination, several significant moments and motives unfold. Meredith Vickers is the first one to awaken from cryosleep. Her early awakening without any help prompts a question about her true nature and capabilities. When Vickers asks, "Did everyone survive?" she directly refers to Peter Weyland, her father, who is secretly aboard the ship.
Any casualties?
Since she doesn't like him, she was hoping that maybe if he's dead, they can just turn around and go back home. Many viewers noticed that Vickers' push-ups are performed with terrible form, but that actually makes sense as she just woken up from cryosleep and her muscles are likely atrophied from the extended period of inactivity. After the rest of the crew awakens from cryosleep, they gather for a meal, a recurring motive in the Alien series, which is also seen in Alien of 1979, Aliens, Alien Covenant, and others. This moment, while seemingly innocent and heartwarming, carries a deep and dark symbolism. The meal scene in Prometheus can be interpreted as a symbolic last meal on death row. The crew unknowingly is about to embark on a mission that will lead to their deaths. Meanwhile, Yannick is decorating a Christmas tree, saying that they arrived on LV-223 on Christmas, which is another reference to Jesus and rebirth. And there's actually an extended version of that scene where camera pans over a little figurine of Jesus.
Ho, ho, ho!
Then the introduction of Fifield and Melbourne brings attention to the underlying class struggle, themes of capitalism and exploitation prevalent in the Alien series. Melbourne mentions that he slept for 2 years and didn't get paid. Then we're introduced to Peter Weyland, capitalist greed personified. His monologue outlines the mission's purpose to uncover humanity's origins and answer fundamental questions about existence and the afterlife. Weyland also mentions that David, the android, doesn't have a soul, which underscores the philosophical and existential question of what it means to be truly alive and sentient. Weyland then says that David is the closest thing to a son that he'll ever have, cruel and calculated dismissal of his actual daughter, Vickers.
His name is David, and he is the closest thing to a son I will ever have.
Which explains her smirk and, in retrospect, makes Weyland even more despicable. It also reframes Vickers' coldness as an emotional armor forged by her father's rejection. Then Charlie and Shaw present various artifacts scattered across time and space on Earth, however, all pointing to the same star formation. Notably, each artifact features a giant figure, roughly twice the size of human, pointing to a star map. This imagery parallels the size difference between the engineers, space jockeys, and humans, emphasizing the godlike stature of the engineers. Shaw interprets the star map as an invitation from the engineers. This optimistic view contrasts with the skepticism of other crew members, particularly Fifield. And there's actually a deleted scene right after this meeting where Shaw argues with Charlie for not backing her up during the meeting. And the reason Charlie did not support Shaw could be because Charlie has a more scientific outlook compared to Shaw, who is primarily driven by faith. This duality between science and religion is the source of the tension between their different perspectives, which will be explored even more in the movie. Since Prometheus takes place before Alien of 1979, some viewers might question how come the design of the Nostromo appears to be so crude and less advanced than the one in Prometheus. The writers actually explained that the Nostromo is a utilitarian industrial tug, while the Prometheus is the state-of-the-art space vessel, specifically designed for Vickers and Weyland, prioritizing maximum comfort and cutting-edge technology. In the next scene, Meredith Vickers asserts her authority over Shaw and Charlie, reminding them that they are her employees, again referencing the theme of class struggle. Their interaction hints at her hidden agenda and her potential conflict with Weyland's intentions that are primarily focused on finding engineers. It's actually funny that when Vickers says that her company paid $1 trillion to fund this mission and that they are her employees, there is a field of wheat behind her symbolizing her status and almost saying that you work for me if you want your dough. The tension between Vickers representing the company's interests and Weyland, the visionary founder, becomes even more evident. Vickers' agenda appears to be more pragmatic, focused on using her findings for research and company's development, which diverges from Weyland's personal quest for existential answers and the extension of his lifespan. The crew had previously sent a transmission to LV-223 containing various art and music pieces, hoping to communicate with the engineers, which is an equivalent of a golden record we sent with the Voyager in 1977. However, the lack of response from the engineers and the silence highlights the sense of humanity's isolation in the universe, and foreshadows the challenges and dangers the crew will face on LV-223. Many people probably ask why Prometheus takes place on LV-223 instead of LV-426. Initially, the expedition was supposed to happen on LV-426 because the studio planned a single prequel. However, as they further developed the script, they realized that the storylines would not fit in a single movie, and that they'll probably have to release multiple sequels in the future where LV-426 will eventually appear. However, the extra materials on Blu-ray actually mention that after LV-223, Prometheus was supposed to go to LV-426. Since according to the files, the corporation already detected a weird signal coming from 426. The sequence of the Prometheus descending to LV-223 was initially planned to be longer and more turbulent, but these scenes were deleted during the production. The name of the moon itself, LV-223, has a dark symbolism. LV-223 can be interpreted as a reference to the biblical verse, Leviticus 22.3, which speaks about ceremonial uncleanliness and being cut off from the presence of the Lord. This verse adds a layer of dark symbolism to the moon, suggesting the opposite of what the crew is trying to find, the absence of God. And the verse reads, "Say to them for the generations to come, if any of your descendants is ceremonially unclean and yet come near the sacred offerings that the Israelite consecrate to the Lord, that person must be cut off from my presence. I am the Lord." The pan-over sequence over LV-223 is actually really similar to the sequence in the beginning of the movie of supposed Earth. The similarity between these two sequences could hint that the seeding of life in the beginning of the movie actually occurred here on LV-223, and it could be that due to engineers' arrogance they destroyed themselves and the planet. The ship's exploration of the moon surface reveals multiple temples and giant lines similar to the Nazca lines in Peru. These lines and structures suggest that the engineers visited Earth and left their mark, becoming godlike figures in ancient myths and legends. The resemblance to Earth's ancient structures reinforces the idea that the engineers influenced human civilizations, shaping their myths and religious beliefs. As the group prepares to go out and explore the temple, the tension rises between David and Charlie. Charlie emphasizes that David is not human, which clearly irritates David. This animosity foreshadows their conflict and David's latent resentment towards Charlie, hinting at why Charlie will become David's first victim. Another detail is when Charlie tells David that they made him to closely mimic humans, and David responds, "Not too close, I hope," which hints at his low opinion about humans and a sense of superiority over them. Another crucial and devilish detail is that the number 6 keeps reoccurring throughout the movie. When the crew arrives on LV-223, there are only 6 hours left before the sunset, and only 6 members of the crew go to explore the temple.
There's only 6 hours left of daylight.
The star formation that they found on multiple ancient artifacts has 6 stars on it. Also, the 666 can be seen on helmet live feeds of every crew member, adding a sinister undertone and hinting at impending doom. The temple that they enter appears to be of artificial origin, significantly weathered by wind and erosion. This suggests its extremely ancient construction and long exposure to the elements. But the design of the temple is based on an old drawing of Giger that was supposed to appear in the original Alien. Then the crew makes their way into the pyramid through a small spiral opening, way too small for an engineer to fit through, hinting that it might be a vent or a broken wall. This tiny opening suggests a possible outbreak or a catastrophe that damaged the structure. Then Fifield uses spherical mappers to scan the pyramid, calling them pups. This term references the way the Nostromo's crew affectionately referred to their equipment in Alien, highlighting the continuity in how technology is humanized by its users. Then the crew reaches the center of the pyramid where something is generating Earth's atmosphere. This discovery is both fascinating and alarming, indicating advanced technology and the possibility of an engineered environment. The water dripping from somewhere above actually reminded me of the Brett's death in Alien. In that scene, water was also dripping from somewhere on the ceiling, and Brett washed his face from the precipitation in this industrial room right before being killed by the xenomorph. Water is often a symbol of baptism, however, since the crew entered a death-worshipping temple, this could instead symbolize the perversion of God and sort of reverse baptism by the devil. Then Charlie takes off his helmet in response to the breathable atmosphere, a reckless and risky move that foreshadows his role as the first victim in the upcoming chaos. The corridors within the temple strongly resemble those in the crashed Juggernaut from the original Alien. Then David touches the hieroglyphs on the wall, activating a holographic recording. The original script explained that the engineers were able to perceive a broader spectrum of light than humans. Consequently, the entire pyramid was filled with signs and symbols visible only to David, thanks to his advanced senses such as infrared and ultraviolet vision. So originally, David could literally see way more than the crew. However, the same idea was realized in the movie with him being able to read engineer writings inaccessible to the crew. At the very beginning of the hologram scene, a bright yellow light appears in the distance for a fraction of a second, symbolizing the light at the end of the tunnel. This imagery evokes religious motifs, and it's a powerful metaphor for heaven and the afterlife, which foreshadows the eventual death of most of the crew. The hologram shows a group of engineers running from an unseen threat. This recording is eerie and adds to the tension, showing the engineers in a moment of fear and desperation. Then, the roar at the end of the hologram belongs to the deacon creatures seen at the end of the movie.
What was that?
The sound indicates that the engineers were running from the deacon or a similar creature. The crew then finds an engineer who was decapitated by a closing door. They carbon date the body to around 2000 years ago, suggesting that the catastrophic event took place around the same time as the crucifixion of Jesus.
How long has it been dead?
2000 years, give or take.
This connection introduces a speculative link between the engineers and significant events in human history. This and many other clues that we're going to see subtly paint a picture that Jesus was directly related to the events of the movie. Shaw tells David not to open the door without knowing what's behind it, but David pretty much ignores her, hinting at his own hidden agenda. His actions show a disregard for human safety and a deeper, possibly sinister motive. Then the crew enters the ampule room, probably one of the most significant locations in the movie, filled with hidden details and references that expand the alien mythology. There is one deleted scene of Melbourne collecting a small worm from the black liquid, calling it our first alien.
Our first alien.
This short scene was removed, but it sort of justifies why Melbourne was so adamant to interact with the hammerpede that killed him. Then Shaw finds the head of the decapitated engineer, which is one of the several heads shown throughout the movie. In the center of the room, there is a giant human head statue surrounded by dozens of urns. The head looks human, suggesting a connection between the engineers and human beings, possibly indicating the engineers' role as creators or gods. The mural on the ceiling depicts an engineer whose hand is being merged with a xenomorph-like being. The being on the ceiling mural has some clear traits of the xenomorph, like tubes around the head and a stripped texture on the hands. The ceiling mural possibly depicts a mutation between an engineer and a xenomorph-like creature, suggesting that the engineers experimented with merging their biology with the xenomorphs. The ceiling mural and the black goo urns appeared to react to Crew's presence. This links to the Leviticus verse mentioning punishment for ceremonially unclean descendants, which directly parallels the human crew that contaminated the sacred room. But the most important object in that scene is the mural at the back of the room. This mural depicts a xenomorph-like creature resembling a deacon in a crucifix pose, suggesting that it was revered as deity by the engineers. This pose indicates a form of worship, drawing parallels to religious iconography. Then, at the bottom of the mural, there's an image of a facehugger impregnating a humanoid being, possibly an engineer. This depiction displays the stages of xenomorph life cycle, emphasizing the engineer's intimate knowledge and possibly reverence for these creatures. The dark imagery and the temple's design suggests that the engineers may have been part of a xenomorph worshipping death cult. This idea aligns with themes explored in the Alien comics, where similar cults appear, worshipping the xenomorph as symbols of death and rebirth. The presence of a skull on top of the temple reinforces the themes of death, further hinting at the engineer's dark rituals and beliefs. In front of the mural, there is a pedestal with a green crystal at its center. Initially, the pedestal was supposed to hold an urn, the same one seen earlier in the movie. The green crystal was likely digitally added at the last stages of production, since the urn appears in most of the trailers. The urn that was supposed to be there would have tied the narrative back to the opening scene of Prometheus. The mural and the urn suggest that the engineers worshipped a xenomorph-like creature, and possibly tried to recreate or harness its power. This worship might have driven their bioengineering experiments, leading to the creation of the black goo and its various effects. If we believe what's in the early draft script, the creature depicted on the wall mural and the ceiling mural is the first deacon. The first deacon's blood is believed to have enabled the engineers to create life on Earth and other planets. However, after its blood ran out, engineers tried to recreate it, leading to the creation of the black goo. The engineers' attempt to recreate the substance that appeared in the opening scene suggests their continuous quest for creation and manipulation of life. But it seems like their ultimate quest leads to their demise, highlighting the film's cautionary tale about playing God. If we look closely, the black goo urns come in various sizes, possibly suggesting different purposes or stages in their use. Then Yannick warns the crew that the storm is coming. Despite the lack of time, David rushes to take one of the urns back to the ship. Unlike Shaw, who carefully bags the engineer's head, David doesn't conceal the urn, highlighting his different priorities and possibly his disregard for safety protocols. And like I mentioned earlier, there appears to be a skull on top of the temple, which is actually a weathered version of the xenomorph head. Given the temple's age, its original design likely resembled H.R. Geiger's iconic biomechanical art, emphasizing the dark and otherworldly aesthetic. On the way back to the Prometheus ship, Shaw drops the bag containing the engineer's head and goes back to recover it. But a storm blows Shaw away and Charlie attempts to help her, but also gets caught in the storm. Luckily, David rescues both of them, creating a false sense of security regarding his character's intentions. Shaw's willingness to risk her life in the storm to retrieve the engineer's head illustrates her unwavering dedication to discovery. This moment underscores her determination to uncover the truth, regardless of the personal cost. There is also a deleted scene where Shaw gives a speech celebrating the proof of extraterrestrial life, declaring that humanity is no longer alone in the universe.
Told me the story of how the world came to be.
This moment emphasizes her excitement and a sense of achievement. However, Charlie interrupts Shaw, downplaying the discovery by pointing out that the creatures that they found are already dead. So the celebration scene juxtaposes the initial excitement of discovery with the harsh reality of their findings, emphasizing the theme of disappointment embodied in Charlie Holloway. However, in the lab, the crew discovers that the engineer's elephantine appearance is actually a helmet. Underneath is a more human-like head, revealing the engineer's biological similarity to humans. The engineer's head has black patches and spots similar to those on the giant head statue, suggesting a possible infection or a reaction to the black goo. The head explodes during the examination, and then Shaw takes DNA samples and finds a match with human DNA, confirming the engineers as humanity's creators. Then David talks to someone in cryosleep who the audience learns later is Peter Weyland. A deleted scene reveals a longer dream sequence where Weyland, as a younger version of himself, is on a yacht and he tells David to do anything to get what he wants. The scene was ultimately cut to keep Weyland's reveal more dramatic later in the film. Vickers then confronts David and forces him to reveal Weyland's instructions, which were to try harder. This interaction hints at David's covert objectives, suggesting that he has a potential agenda beyond the mission's company's goals. David's actions appear to be driven by a blend of obedience to Weyland and his own curiosity. In fact, the film is just layered with hidden agendas to the point that nobody really knows who to trust. David is supposed to serve Weyland, however, he also pursues his own ambitions of a creator. Weyland, on the other hand, masqueraded the entire mission as a science research project, but behind it is his own selfish desire to extend his life. Another really interesting thing is that Vickers was able to push David around, despite him being an android way stronger than a regular human, and we'll come back later to the reason why she was able to do it. While Shaw examines engineered blood samples, in parallel, David conducts his own research at the same time. As Shaw asks what killed them, the camera focuses on the black goo, hinting that this is the deadly agent responsible for the engineer's downfall. An interesting detail is that David has a Weyland-Yutani logo on his fingerprint, symbolizing his complete integration and ownership by the company. David says, "Big things have small beginnings," which is another line from Lawrence of Arabia movie. It's also a comment about the Alien franchise in general, in a sense that the black goo leads to a chain of events that ultimately result in the xenomorph. Holloway is later seen alone with a bottle of champagne in a rec room, and according to Damon Lindelof, the scriptwriter for Prometheus, this is the most important scene in the movie. Charlie Holloway is extremely disappointed since, just like he stated in the interviews, he wanted to find creatures who created humans to disprove all world's religions and to disprove God. As opposed to Shaw, he clearly doesn't believe in God, which can be interpreted that he's hollow inside, therefore the name Holloway. The scene starts with Holloway playing with the figurine of Jesus. This act can be seen as a dismissive and disrespectful, reflecting his disappointment and frustration with their findings. And almost as punishment for disrespecting Jesus, God sends David, who poisons Holloway with the black goo. David carries the drop of the black goo on his finger and dips it into Charlie's drink right in front of him. Holloway's dismissive attitude towards David makes him oblivious to David's capabilities and intentions, so he doesn't even realize that he's being poisoned. But interestingly, Charlie drinks champagne from a bottle that is a part of the personal collection of Sonia Klaus, the film's set decorator, and each bottle of this champagne costs around 1,000 euros. However, this scene between David and Holloway could be one of the most important scenes in the entire movie, as it encapsulates the central theme of humanity's quest for existential answers. Humans seek to understand why their creators, the engineers, brought them into existence. In parallel, humans created David, a synthetic human, simply because they could. This suggests that the engineers might have created humanity for the same arbitrary reasons, hinting that humans might have been created as mere experiments without any grand or cosmic purpose. Additionally, the screenwriter noted that when David asks Holloway what would he do to achieve his goals, Holloway replies, "Everything and anything." This response, according to the writers, triggers a pivotal moment in David's reasoning, leading him to justify poisoning Holloway as a means to complete Weyland's orders. Since at this point David thought that all engineers are dead and the black goo is the only thing that can get him closer to what the boss wants. In David's reasoning, if Holloway is willing to do everything and anything, David is also allowed to do the most extreme and unethical things like experimenting on Holloway. This scene is really twisted since it looks like Holloway almost gave permission to David to poison him. Another interesting observation is that in a weird way, David almost competes with Holloway for Shaw's attention. And it's almost like David is trying to win Elizabeth over and get rid of Holloway. David was the one who saved Shaw from the storm, and there seems to be some weird affection between David and Shaw. In the Alien Covenant prologue script, it's actually implied that David had close intimacy with Shaw, which is just really bizarre and disturbing. However, David's affection towards Shaw could be another twisted reason why he chose Holloway to experiment on. Then we're cut to Fifield and Milburn, who discover a pile of dead engineer bodies. One of the bodies appears to have been opened up from the inside, suggesting a xenomorph-like creature emerged from it. This discovery hints at the catastrophic outbreak that occurred in the temple. We can also see that the walls are covered in extensive engineer writings. According to the book Making of Prometheus, the cuneiform writing is a mix of Proto-Indo-European languages constructed to appear real but intentionally meaningless to avoid accidentally saying something silly, which is kind of disappointing because I hoped that these writings would give us some clues about engineers' lore or history. From Fifield and Milburn, a pair of friends would transition to another couple, Shaw and Holloway, in their room. In their discussion, Shaw reveals that she's sterile and cannot have children. This revelation adds a personal layer to Shaw's character, emphasizing her desire for creation, a wish that will actually be fulfilled in the most horrifying way. However, there's a longer, deleted version of that scene where Shaw speculates about what caused the engineer's head to explode, and suggests that a virus might have wiped out the engineers. Holloway replies that he doesn't really care and says that the only reason she came to this planet is to ask God why he took her mother and father, which angers Shaw and she slaps Charlie in the face. Then Holloway suggests that Shaw take off her crucifix given to her by her father, which was seen in the dream sequence, highlighting Holloway's further detachment from faith. But Shaw responds that finding the engineers doesn't negate the existence of God. She argues that it leads to the looping question of who created the engineers and then who created their creators and so on. At night, everybody seems to split in couples like Holloway and Shaw, Milburn and Fifield, so then we're cut to Vickers visiting Yannick, who's playing a harmonica that once belonged to Stephen Stills. It's a pretty obscure reference, and I'm pretty sure just like Vickers, very few people from the audience knew who Stephen Stills is. But Yannick sings one of Stills' songs, and if you can't be with the one you love the one you're with, possibly hinting that Vickers likes him more than he likes her. It seems like the entire scene with Vickers and Yannick is supposed to be a comedic relief. That's why it's kind of ridiculous. Then Yannick asks Vickers if she's a robot, referring to her cold and calculated demeanor. Vickers responds by inviting him to her room, almost like she's trying to prove that she's not a robot. However, there are some theories suggesting that Vickers might actually be an android, just like David. The evidence supporting this theory includes her ability to push David around, hinting at similar strength. Then there's another question: how come she was able to wake up on her own from cryosleep in the beginning of the movie? There are actually many other proofs that she might be an android, with even Ridley Scott kind of confirming it, but we won't get into this in this video. Then we're cut back to Fifield and Milburn, who embody human curiosity and stupidity. That's why they decide to camp in the ampule room despite the obvious dangers posed by the unknown substances and potential pathogens. Maybe they decided to stay there because it had a giant head statue, the only thing similar to humanity in this temple, which created a false sense of comfort. Another subtle detail is that Fifield appears to be under the influence of illicit substances, which could explain his reckless behavior. The worms in the ampule room that we saw previously now mutated into hammerpedes, snake-like creatures due to the influence of the black goo. Despite the clear danger, Melbourne reaches out to the creature, mirroring his initial curiosity when meeting Fifield. However, this inherent curiosity ultimately leads to his demise as the hammerpede attacks, breaks his hand, and crawls into his mouth. Melbourne's lack of caution may seem foolish, and even Quentin Tarantino criticized this moment as particularly dumb. However, it's important to remember that Melbourne is a xenobiologist who just discovered the first ever alien lifeform. This monumental discovery amplifies his curiosity, and his behavior actually aligns with his character's scientific passion and general enthusiasm. The hammerpede's attack is a biblical reference to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, symbolizing the perversion of innocence and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The hammerpede's acid blood, which burns through Fifield's helmet, hints at the creature's similarity to xenomorphs, which indicates the presence of the xenomorph DNA in the black goo. The next morning, Charlie wakes up drenched in sweat, clearly showing signs of illness. This condition is the first visible sign that the black goo is affecting him. Since Charlie and Shaw had intimate contact, Shaw is now infected with something. However, in the original script called Alien Engineers, Charlie was attacked by an alien facehugger when they first entered the pyramid. Although the facehugger was removed, the embryo continued to grow inside him, similar to what happened to Cain. In that alternate script, the chestburster emerged from Charlie while he was in bed with Shaw, leading to a gruesome and heartbreaking death. This alternate scene was likely altered to avoid being too vile for audiences, but I personally wouldn't mind seeing it on the screen. But back to the movie, a cross tattoo on Charlie's shoulder is subtly revealed, which is another Christian symbol. But the most disturbing detail is this parasite in Charlie's eyeball. I'm not actually sure if the parasite is real or the movie's trying to show that Charlie is hallucinating. In any case, this image is the literal representation of the evil eye, suggesting that David jinxed Charlie or that Charlie is possessed by a demon. While most of the crew searches for Melbourne and Fifield, David explores a tunnel where one of the mapping devices stopped working. The device actually makes dog-like sounds, which is why Fifield named it a pup. Then David discovers another room filled with urns, potentially thousands of them. Next, David enters the orrery room, discovering 4 cryosleep pods. It's actually hard to notice, but 3 of these pods have holes in them, indicating that xenomorph-like creatures bursted out from the engineers inside, leaving only one intact. David finds a control panel with weirdly looking buttons, almost like if they were made out of organic material. Then David activates a hologram showing 4 engineers entering the room, with one playing a flute to activate the ship. The flute is an extremely peculiar detail that can appear random at first. However, in Christian symbolism, musical instruments often represent the soul. The fact that the pilot of the ship has to play the flute can be sort of a safety mechanism to ensure that only a living being with a soul can operate the ship. However, David was able to hijack this mechanism, maybe hinting that he actually has a soul after all, despite Weyland clearly saying that he doesn't have a soul. In general, the film subtly incorporates various musical instruments such as Yannick's harmonica and the engineer's flute. This parallel draws a connection between the captains of spaceships and their use of musical instruments. At first I thought that Ridley Scott just chose a random object from his bag for this scene and it happens to be a flute. However, the flute rabbit hole is actually way deeper and suggests that the ship has to be emotionally stimulated to be awakened. leading to various theories about ships being alive on some level, and I've made a whole separate video about it. But engineer playing the flute can imply that not only juggernaut ships integrate organic material, they might be semi-conscious, or have a form of awareness. That's why the use of music is needed to control it. The use of the flute can also be a reference to snake charmers, street performers who hypnotize and trick their snakes to dance and sway to the music they play on their flutes. Once the engineer activates certain mechanisms, a stunning hologram appears in the center, arguably one of the most visually captivating moments in sci-fi cinema. Ridley Scott actually drew inspiration for this scene from Joseph Riding's painting, a philosopher giving a lecture on the orrery. When the star map hologram is activated, it reveals 6 different locations, each corresponding to a galaxy. Again, the occurrence of number 6 is really interesting since, as I mentioned earlier, there are 6 temples on LV-223. The star map broadens the scope of the engineer's bioexperiments beyond our galaxy, suggesting that they may have seeded life on a single planet in each galaxy. The hologram is a recording from 2000 years ago, just before the outbreak on LV-223. It seems like the engineers planned to launch their ship filled with black goo urns to Earth, indicating a deliberate attempt to destroy humanity. Interestingly, David stands in the center of the hologram and spreads his arms in a crucifix pose, mirroring the engineer in the chair who is in the same position, which creates a visual parallel reinforcing religious symbolism. After the hologram ends, David notices that one of the cryosleep pods contains a living engineer, which is evidenced by an audible heartbeat. Meanwhile, in the temple, the crew finds Melbourne's dead body, which appears smoking and almost burnt, which draws parallels to biblical references of sinners burning in hell. There's also a deleted scene in which the crew finds Fifield's shed skin in the temple, hinting at his eventual horrific mutation. It can also be seen as a direct reference to this moment in Alien. Then Holloway gets really sick, prompting the crew to return to the ship. His condition rapidly worsens, and it becomes clear that the mutation is irreversible. Holloway wants to prevent contaminating others, so he spreads his arms in a crucifix pose as he's burnt alive by Vickers. This pose symbolizes self-sacrifice and echoes Christian imagery of crucifixion. And his death by fire serves as a biblical reference to sinners burning in hell, paralleling Melbourne's burnt body. As Charlie is burnt alive, Shaw's scream and the transition to the white fade symbolizes a metaphorical transport to heaven. Charlie's fiery death can be seen as a sinner's end, while Shaw's symbolic transport to heaven emphasizes her purity and faith. The scene shows Shaw in a white robe wearing her crucifix again, almost like she's in heaven. However, things are actually the complete opposite. In a weird way, her wish of being able to be pregnant is fulfilled as David tells Shaw that she's pregnant with a non-human fetus. This development fulfills Shaw's wish to be pregnant in the most diabolical manner. Even though Shaw technically got pregnant from Charlie, it is David's black goo that formed the embryo. So in a bizarre and twisted way, Holloway actually implanted David's seed into Shaw. The drop of the black goo was sort of the actual seed, and the fact that it came from David almost symbolizes that it's actually David who got Shaw pregnant with an unwanted embryo. David also takes away Shaw's crucifix, symbolically disconnecting her from God. As David sedates Shaw for cryostasis, he mentions that he watched Shaw's dreams, making him even creepier. The company's willingness to sacrifice Shaw for the alien fetus highlights the theme of corporate greed and the ethical dilemmas for scientific discovery. This highlights the broader Alien franchise's critique of corporate exploitation and disregard for human life. As other scientists approach the unconscious Shaw, she attacks them and escapes to the medical pod room in Vickers' module. Shaw discovers the medpod is calibrated for a male, suggesting it was meant for Peter Weyland, who is later revealed to be on the ship. This calibration for males underscores layered agendas and the secrecy of this mission. The medpod's male calibration also hints at another theory, that Vickers might be an android, thus not needing a medpod designed for human females. This adds to the ambiguity of Vickers' character and the underlying mysteries of the film. The extraction of the trilobite from Shaw closely resembles childbirth, underscored by the intense pain and excruciating efforts Shaw experiences. This scene symbolizes the horror of unnatural creation and the corruption of the natural birth processes. The creature that was extracted is known as trilobite, and it looks like an octopus. It is actually the first time an alien was extracted from a human without killing them. Shaw instantly hates the trilobite, understandably so, however, it still fits in the theme of creators hating their creations. Shaw actually occupies the role of an inverted Virgin Mary, a mother figure whose miraculous conception produces a monster instead of a savior. Shaw becomes pregnant despite her infertility, but her pregnancy is not holy, and she gives birth to a demonic deity. In Christian tradition, Mary gives birth to salvation. In Prometheus, Shaw gives birth to annihilation, the deacon, so the inversion is total. Right after we're introduced to the trilobite, another creature appears on the doorsteps of the Prometheus ship, Mutated Fifield. Mutated Fifield's body is twisted like a crab, with his legs grotesquely bent over his shoulders. This design is a nod to Ridley Scott's original concept for Alien of 1979, known as the Alien Box. In the comic book adaptation by Goodwin and Simonson, the alien squashes itself into a box shape and then unfolds. An idea that Dan O'Bannon mentioned was filmed but then cut from the original movie. So it looks like Scott repurposed this concept for Fifield's mutation in Prometheus. The twisted form of Fifield also resembles Ridley Scott's drawing called Freudian. This visual reference further connects Scott's work across different projects and emphasizes the grotesque mutation. Fifield attacks the crew and is eventually burned, again echoing the biblical fire for sinners. However, there's actually way more to that scene. Multiple versions of Fifield's mutations were conceived, and only one was filmed, showing a more xenomorph-like appearance. The Blu-ray release includes an alternate attack scene showcasing these different designs and emphasizing the evolutionary link to the xenomorphs, which in my opinion look way better than the final version that we got in the film. Fifield's attack is paralleled with Shaw stumbling through the corridors weakened after the surgery. This juxtaposition highlights the physical and emotional chaos on the ship. Then Shaw returns to the medical room and finds Weyland, which is one of the film's biggest plot twists. Weyland reveals that he has only a few days to live, and the true purpose of the mission is seeking salvation from death by asking the engineer for more life. This revelation ties into the themes of mortality, the quest for eternal life, and the hubris of trying to overcome natural limits. Shaw tells Weyland that this place is the complete opposite of what they thought. Instead of a holy place, the engineer's temple appears to be a site of worship of a parasitic, death-bringing entity, contrasting sharply with their expectations of finding a benevolent creator. The engineer's almost satanic worship turns their anticipated holy discovery into a malevolent one, and almost everything seems to be the evil version of what they were expecting to find. However, despite Shaw's warnings, Weyland insists on meeting the last surviving engineer. His determination highlights his arrogance and the desperation of his quest for immortality, something that the money can't buy. One big question people had about Weyland is why casting Guy Pearce, a relatively young actor, to play a nearly 100-year-old man. And Scott explained that although he wanted Weyland to be extremely old, the goal was to make his eyes look young and lively, as a way to show that his soul was way younger than his body. Weyland also appears to be heavily influenced by David, who omits critical information about the dangerous substance, the black goo, stored in the temple and destined for Earth. David's selective communication indicates a form of manipulation. David's actions suggest that while he appears to be loyal to Weyland, he actually operates based on his own hidden agenda. David's manipulation and selective truth-telling suggests that he serves neither Weyland nor the company, but rather his own interests, hinting at the autonomy and the unpredictability of artificial intelligence. Shaw then goes back to her room and washes her face in the same way as Charlie did right before going to the pyramid, hinting that Shaw might face the same fate as her partner. A deleted scene shows Shaw praying in front of the mirror, which highlights her reliance on faith despite the dire circumstances. There is another deleted scene in which Yannick visits Vickers in her module. In that scene, Vickers is visibly shaken after killing Holloway, adding a layer of vulnerability to her character. This scene sort of humanizes Vickers, showing her internal conflict and trauma. Yannick also plays the piano, continuing the motif of captains playing musical instruments. Then Yannick recounts a military mission where he had to destroy a lab after a pathogen leak. This scene provides a direct parallel to the black goo outbreak on LV-223 and the catastrophic consequences of bioengineering. Although the scene adds depth to Vickers' character and provides a clear explanation of the black goo outbreak, it was likely cut to maintain ambiguity and allow the audience to piece together the engineer's fate themselves. But let's go back to Shaw. She puts on Charlie's ring, which he left on the mirror shelf with the inscription "Capt. A.C. Holloway." The ring symbolizes her connection to Charlie and her determination to fulfill his dream of meeting the engineers. If we remember, Charlie was almost depressed because all the engineers were dead and he was actually hoping to meet some of them. The ring also represents the last tangible piece of Charlie, signifying his presence and influence on Shaw's mission. By wearing the ring and continuing the mission, Shaw is symbolically reuniting with Charlie and honoring his memory. So this gesture signifies her resolve to fulfill his aspirations even after his death. Then we get a scene of intense and hostile interaction between Vickers and Weyland. In a pretty shocking plot twist, she reveals that Weyland is her father, adding a layer of familial conflict and highlighting her struggle for his approval. Vickers literally kneels in front of Weyland, attempting to reconcile before he meets the engineer. This act of submission underscores her desperation for his acknowledgement and love. However, Weyland completely dismisses Vickers, showing his unwavering belief that the engineer will grant him immortality. His rejection highlights his corrupt nature and makes him even more despicable. Also, Weyland's earlier statement that David is the closest thing to a son I will ever have takes on a completely different meaning. This remark deeply affects Vickers, as evidenced by her reaction. However, the scene is not just about Weyland simply disliking his own daughter. There's actually way more to it. Weyland's rejection of Vickers, his own daughter, symbolizes a creator's dissatisfaction with their creation. This foreshadows the later encounter between the engineer and humans, highlighting a recurring theme of creators rejecting their creations. Then Yannick visits Shaw in her room, advising her against going to the pyramid. Shaw reminds him of his self-proclaimed limitation that he's just the captain of the ship. This interaction reveals Yannick's growing realization that the mission's implications extend far beyond their immediate goals and could potentially affect the entire human race. The film subtly hints that Yannick will emerge as the true hero, foreshadowing his crucial role in literally saving humanity later in the movie. Once the crew prepares to leave the pyramid, David expresses a cynical and passive-aggressive attitude towards Shaw. His comment, "Doesn't everybody want their parents dead?" suggests his awareness of the dangers he is withholding from Weyland. This remark underscores his manipulative nature and foreshadows his betrayal. David's actions exemplify how he manipulates the truth, lying by omission to serve his own agenda, and possibly even to protect himself, as he mentions that when Weyland is dead, I will be free. Meanwhile, Yannick and Vickers analyze the holographic diagram and realize that the last engineer is located in the Juggernaut ship, which contains a cargo of black goo urns. Although only David knows the ship's course is set to Earth, Yannick likely begins to suspect this himself, adding to the tension and urgency. Weyland's decision to awaken the engineer despite the potential hostility and catastrophic consequences embodies extreme greed and ultimate selfishness. With only a few days to live, Weyland risks the entire human race for a chance to extend his own life. This action is the ultimate act of arrogance and moral corruption. Weyland's willingness to endanger humanity for personal gain foreshadows the destructive consequences of unchecked ambition and the dangers of playing God. On the other hand, Yannick's evolving understanding of the mission's stakes and his eventual actions underscore themes of heroism and sacrifice. Therefore, Yannick serves as a counterpoint to Weyland's selfishness. In the temple, David says that the air is perfectly breathable and tells Shaw that it's not the air that infected Charlie, pretty much admitting that he knows the real cause, almost revealing that he had something to do with it. Then we get to the most important scene, the culmination of the entire movie, which is meeting the engineer. And there are so many layers to that scene that it should be analyzed in great detail. David uses the flute to activate the ship, which symbolizes a jailbreak. The flute was intended to ensure that only living beings with souls could operate the ship, a safety measure to prevent androids or other artificial beings from taking control. David, bypassing this mechanism, highlights the inherent dangers of AI as it can manipulate and override safeguards. Then David, sitting in the captain's chair, symbolizes his control over the entire situation. This visual clue emphasizes that the unfolding events are the result of his manipulations, showcasing his pivotal role in the narrative. The design of the engineer's suit is another interesting detail. The engineer's suit is merged with his body and bears a certain similarity to the design of the xenomorph, which highlights the connection between engineers and the creature that they worshipped. It's also possible that the engineers are a result of the merger of engineers we saw in the beginning of the movie and xenomorphs, just like it's portrayed on the ceiling mural. Then Shaw gets on her knees due to pain, but symbolically she's almost submitting to the gods, in this case the engineers. In the theatrical cut, the engineer attacks the crew right away, but there's actually a deleted dialogue between Weyland, engineer, and David. In the deleted scene, David tells the engineer that Weyland wants to extend his life, basically asking the engineer for more life. The engineer responds saying why Weyland deserves more life. I have a separate video with a complete breakdown of this dialogue that was actually way longer in one of the draft scripts, so definitely check it out if you haven't seen it yet. In the deleted scene, we get a short monologue from the greedy, insatiable billionaire in which his arrogance, selfishness, and hubris are in full display. But most amazingly, his speech culminates in the highest level of delusion, with Weyland calling himself a god. That man, pointing to David, my company built him from nothing. I made him in my own image, so he would be perfect, so he would never fail. I deserve this because you and I, we are superior. We are creators, we are gods, and gods never die. Even though David doesn't translate Weyland's monologue, the engineers seem to understand everything, and there's a subtle change in his look as he realizes that humanity has fallen. Weyland's actions mirror the Prometheus myth, where Prometheus stole fire from the gods. In the movie Prometheus, Weyland steals the privilege of creating life by developing David, an artificial being. This could be why the engineer reacts so violently, seeing Weyland's actions as a transgression of divine boundaries. But in the same deleted scene, Weyland reaches out to the engineer with his finger, mimicking the famous painting The Creation of Adam by Michelangelo. This visual reference underscores the theme of creation and the relationship between creator and creation. But the scene also references Blade Runner, where a replicant asks his creator Tyrell for more life. This intertextual reference connects Ridley Scott's exploration of artificial life and existential questions across his films. But if we dig even deeper in the draft script, the engineer says that humans are too violent, which is why they need to be wiped out. And obviously hitting Shaw right in front of the engineer exactly proved his point, but I go in much more detail about this in a separate video. Another interesting clue is that according to the Prometheus documentary, the engineer is referred to as the last engineer, possibly the last one of their race. After the engineer kills the crew, he proceeds to finish his plan to launch the ship to Earth with its deadly cargo of pathogenic urns. One explanation is that the engineer was put into cryosleep during an outbreak about 2,000 years ago, which coincides with the crucifixion of Jesus. This timing suggests that the engineer's decision to wipe out humanity was triggered by their final and failed attempt to guide humans through Jesus. The early draft script goes even further, explaining that Jesus' absence for 18 years was his journey to the engineer's homeworld, paradise. Jesus was the engineer's last attempt to guide humanity onto the right path, and his crucifixion convinced them that humanity was irredeemably violent, necessitating their complete eradication. When the engineer attacks, he first rips off David's head, making it the third decapitated head in the movie. Ridley Scott actually has a weird obsession with human heads, and decapitations appear in many of his movies. Just in his Alien movies alone, there were so many detached human heads, but they also appear in his other movies like The Gladiator or The Canceller. But one theory suggests that the engineer's violent reaction towards David stems from an inherent disgust towards non-organic beings, and that is reflected in the engineer's biomechanical technology. Just as Weyland hates his daughter, the engineers also hate their creations, humans. Then the platform with cryopods transforms and the pilot chair emerges, identical to the one seen in Alien of 1979. What's really fascinating is that this practical set and the chair were specifically built for Prometheus, and they were fully functional. Then the engineer merges with the chair, mirroring the iconic space jockey image. The severity of the situation then becomes evident as the Juggernaut ship takes off. Shaw warns Yannick that the ship will destroy Earth if not stopped. Despite his initial reluctance to go beyond his role, Yannick disobeys Vickers' orders and prepares to collide Prometheus with the Juggernaut, sacrificing his life for humanity. This act of heroism cements Yannick as the true hero of the story. However, initially Prometheus was intended to be a single prequel to Alien, with the engineer in the pilot chair being the same being as the fossilized space jockey from the 1979 film. In one of the early scripts called Alien Engineers, the awakened engineer had an embryo growing inside of him, which is why he rushed to launch the Juggernaut ship. However, the Ultramorph emerged from him as the ship took off, causing the crash, and resulting in the dead space jockey pilot with a hole in his chest inside of the crashed Juggernaut, just like in the original Alien. However, as Prometheus project grew bigger and bigger, potential storylines became much more intricate, and the script was changed to accommodate more prequels like Alien Covenant. So in the movie, the Juggernaut crashed for a different reason. Yannick locks the Prometheus on a collision course with the engineer's ship as Vickers escapes. There is also a short clip where Vickers tells Yannick that he was a terrible lad, referring to their earlier encounter. Vickers' escape sort of mirrors the last engineer's escape from the temple's catastrophe, highlighting the theme of survival amidst the chaos. Another interesting detail is that Yannick wears a compass, which is practically useless in space. But symbolically it represents his moral compass, his ethical and moral judgment that guides him to make the right decisions, free from greed and hubris. As the ship is about to crash, Yannick raises his hands in a crucifix pose, symbolizing his self-sacrifice to save the entire human race. So his actions sharply contrast with Weyland's selfish quest for immortality. Interestingly, the collision completely destroys the Prometheus, but the Juggernaut ship remains structurally intact. However, it still loses its firepower and momentum, causing it to collapse and roll. The rolling Juggernaut with its circular shape resembles the Ouroboros. a symbol depicting a snake eating its own tail, representing the eternal cycle of birth and death. Another interesting detail is that after the crash, low-frequency rhythmic sounds can be heard, which is not part of the musical score. These sounds could be the dying screams of the semi-conscious engineer ship, reflecting its biomechanical nature and suggesting that it is in some sense alive. Vickers and Shaw run from the rolling juggernaut, however, Vickers is then crushed by it, and her seemingly silly death actually carries a deeper symbolism. Vickers' death marks the end of Weyland's legacy and blood lineage. Instead of seeking true immortality through his children like Vickers, Weyland pretty much not only emotionally rejected his daughter in the earlier scenes, but also awakened the forces that killed her, therefore ending his life and blood lineage. Vickers' death also shows the inescapable nature of fate. Despite all her efforts to assert control and distance herself from her father's actions, she is ultimately caught in the destructive path set by Weyland. There is also a deleted scene of the engineer getting out of the pilot chair and escaping from the crashed juggernaut, running through the ship's debris. On the other hand, Shaw nearly escapes death again, just like she did with the trilobite and the engineer encounter, following her archetype of a survivor. Then Shaw returns to Vickers' escape module that is in complete disarray. Books scattered on the floor suggest the abandonment and ruin of intellectual pursuits, and the idea that the quest for knowledge had led to chaos and destruction rather than enlightenment. The disarray of the books also mirrors Shaw's internal agony and the failed ambitions of the Prometheus mission, highlighting the dangers of pursuing forbidden or dangerous knowledge without fully understanding its implications. The scene of Shaw in the escape module is actually much longer and involves a deleted fight between her and the engineer. While it's not explicitly clear why the engineer specifically goes after Shaw, comics suggest that the engineers have a deep hatred for humans. In the alternate scene, the engineer explores the escape module, watching a video of a girl playing the violin and visibly amazed by it. There is even a scene of him reading a book. His calm behavior contrasts with his later aggression, suggesting that he might initially had no intentions to harm Shaw. And if we look closely, when the engineer approaches her, Shaw is the first one to make a brisk movement that can be interpreted as a threat. So the biggest difference between the deleted scene and the movie is that in the deleted scene it's really ambiguous who attacks first. But the scene implies that the engineer might have been observing Shaw rather than immediately intending to harm her. The reason the engineer notices Shaw is because David kept talking to Shaw on the radio, making lots of noise, even though Shaw told him to be quiet. David actually warned Shaw that the engineer is coming so she could prepare. But he's also the reason the engineer found Shaw behind the table. It seems like these conflicting signals is a part of David's strategy to gain trust, only to then use it in pursuit of his own goals. This highly manipulative behavior truly illustrates David's cunning and twisted nature. But once they start fighting, she manages to hit the engineer with an axe multiple times, revealing his dark-colored blood, similar to the liquid in the urns. This further supports the theory that the substance in the urns could be related to the engineer's biology, possibly being the recreation of the blood of the xenomorph deity that they worshipped. Eventually, the engineer overpowers Shaw, grabbing her head and seemingly attempting to decapitate her, mirroring his earlier decapitation of David. But then Shaw opens the door to the medical room, releasing the now enormous trilobite. Another detail is that the trilobite then attacks the engineer. Shaw is technically the trilobite's mother, so symbolically the creature's attack can be seen as a protective instinct towards her. Despite the engineer's immense strength, the trilobite overpowers him and implants an alien embryo inside him. An interesting detail is that the production initially manufactured a physical full-size trilobite and tried to use it to create a more realistic scene. However, using it for the scene was way more challenging than they expected. So they decided to go for a CGI version of the trilobite, which still looked amazing. So as the trilobite is impregnating the engineer, Shaw manages to escape and she is physically and emotionally exhausted. There is an alternate version of the movie ending from Blu-ray that we're going to explore, since it ties directly to the engineer homeworld and is way more interesting than the theatrical version. Shaw says, "God, I'm sorry Charlie, I can't do it anymore," referring to the promise to her dead boyfriend to keep going. Shaw's desperation can be explained by the fact that the escape module, the only place where she could have stayed at, is now unavailable, and there's no apparent way for her to go back home. So in that moment, she's completely stuck on a deserted moon with a few hours left to live. However, David contacts her via radio, revealing that he's still alive. She asks him, "That thing that took your head off, what did it say, David?" "A thing, not too long ago you considered them gods," David replied. "God never tried to kill me, so what did he say? Where did he come from?" There is no direct translation, but several of your ancient cultures had a word similar to it, paradise. David replied as Shaw getting into a cart car and driving to the crashed juggernaut. In the crashed juggernaut, Shaw finds David's head a few meters away from his body. This fragmentation mirrors the fragmented and dual identity of David's character, appearing human but ultimately following his own agenda. In line with the Prometheus myth, David's decapitation could symbolize the punishment for overreaching forbidden boundaries, just as Prometheus was punished for giving fire to humanity. David's severed head signifies the consequences of his curiosity and autonomy beyond what is expected or permitted for an android. Interestingly, Shaw is the only human survivor of the crew, hinting that her belief in God could be the reason why she's still alive. Symbolically, all other crew members believed in science to explain the origins of life, so they sort of rejected God, thinking that they can be equal to them, and they were all punished. When Shaw approaches David, she asks for her father's cross that David took from her. Surprisingly, David carried it with him all this time. By asking for her cross back, Shaw is reclaiming a part of her identity and reaffirming her faith. And in a strange way, all the horrors with alien monsters happened when Shaw did not have her cross with her. But David's act of keeping the cross once again highlights his layered personality. While he is an android following Weyland's orders, he also shows moments of curiosity and even some sort of affection and empathy towards Shaw. First, David tells Shaw that he can fly another Juggernaut ship back to Earth, but Shaw says that she instead wants to go to the engineer homeworld. David asks her, "May I ask what you plan to achieve by going there?" Shaw replies, "They created us, they tried to kill us, they changed their minds, I deserve to know why." "Doesn't matter why they changed their minds." "Yes, it does. I don't understand why," David asked. Then Shaw stood up and said, "I guess it's because I'm a human and you're a freaking robot." Then she brutally grabbed him by the hair and shoved his head in the bag. This scene is different from what we got in the movie, where Shaw is almost apologetic to David, as opposed to this alternate ending where she's hostile towards him. The reason David is so confused as to why Shaw wants to ask engineers these questions is because he could talk to his creators, Weyland, and humans. And humans had a very dismissive and nihilistic reason for David's existence. As Charlie said, they simply created David because they could. And almost every human treats David as an advanced tea dispenser, probably hinting that engineers view humans in the same way, just as a tool. However, besides this ending that can be found on Blu-ray, there is also another ending in John Spain's script called Alien Engineers. In John Spain's alternate ending, the engineer already had an alien embryo inside of him while in cryosleep. However, the embryo was dormant, just like the engineer. After awakening, the embryo started growing, so when the Juggernaut was about to take off, the Ultramorph erupted from the engineer's chest and through the suit, killing the engineer. Yannick had only a few seconds before the ship computer could take over, so he crashed Prometheus into the Juggernaut just like in the movie. Then the newly emerged Ultramorph chases Shaw, and as the alien gets closer and closer to Shaw, she finds a diamond-bladed saw and impales the Ultramorph's head. Then Shaw enters Vickers' module with various amenities where she finally relaxes. Since in that version the engineer is dead, there is no one to come after her in this module. In the meantime, David's head contacts Shaw from the crashed Juggernaut, and David asks Shaw to fix him in exchange for showing how to operate the engineer's ship. However, Shaw says, "I'm not going to fix you, David. I don't need you. I'll hold out. A ship will come." David replies, "I'm certain, but who will send it, men or engineers?" Which convinces Shaw to fix David and leave this moon before the arrival of furious gods. And the last paragraph of this alternate script is really interesting. Apparently, David managed to operate a bigger ship shaped like a pyramid. The massive central pyramid rises in the midst of the engineer complex. With a boom, a bright beam of light shines forth from its peak, punching straight up through the clouds like a laser. Other beams of light erupt from other pyramids, scorching the sky with their brightness. On LV-426 orbit, the barren moon hangs in space, its father planet, angry red god, in the background. 24 beams of light rise from the moon, visible even from space, a beacon, a signal, a beginning. Images depicting lights erupting from pyramids can be seen on Prometheus concept art, suggesting that this alternate ending was seriously considered. And in that alternate script, the crew arrived on LV-426 instead of LV-223. But let's go back to the actual movie. After reclaiming her cross from David, Shaw lowers his body from the Juggernaut and puts his head in a bag. David's talking head in a bag is a pretty strong reference to Mimir's head in Norse mythology. Mimir, a wise being, is beheaded during the Aesir-Vanir War. Odin, the chief of the gods, carries Mimir's head around, and it continues to provide counsel and wisdom. Mimir's head represents the preservation of knowledge and wisdom beyond physical death, which parallels Shaw's need to bring David's head along for its valuable information and helping her to escape the moon. Next, Shaw drives to another engineer temple, and then a Juggernaut ship takes off and disappears, suggesting that Shaw and David left LV-223. However, that's not the end of the film, and we transition to what many fans consider the culmination of the entire film, the birth of the Deacon creature, a precursor to the infamous xenomorph. In Vickers' module, the engineer convulses violently before a sharp, conical shape bursts through his stomach from the inside. A creature emerges from the engineer host, accompanied by a strange yellow sac. For a few moments, we can actually hear a heartbeat-like sound synchronized with the pulsing sac. It could be the engineer's heart, or even a precursor to an alien egg. In some concept arts, the Deacon is depicted biting its own umbilical cord, although this detail did not make it into the final film. Originally, the Deacon was intended to play a more significant role, causing chaos on the Prometheus ship. Extended materials and comics suggest that the Deacon grows larger over time, eventually becoming a mountain, a strange but intriguing concept. It could also imply that these temples with skulls on top of them are skeletal remains of overgrown deacons. But this deacon that emerged from the engineer closely resembles the creature depicted on the mural in the engineer temple. However, it's really unclear if these two creatures are the same. The Deacon appears more similar to the engineers than to xenomorphs, given its fully developed limbs. It's possible that this Deacon is the exact same creature the engineers worshipped, as the temple mural depicts a facehugger impregnating a humanoid, hinting at the Deacon's life cycle. Initially, the Deacon was likely intended to be the predecessor of the xenomorph, possessing a similar secondary jaw. However, based on the controversial feedback that Prometheus received, the studio developed Alien Covenant, which suggests that David played a significant role in the creation of the xenomorph species, which I personally did not like. David creating or recreating the alien diminishes the xenomorphs to a simple biological monster, as opposed to Lovecraftian, mysterious, and reality-bending entity that it was in the original Alien. As you can see, Prometheus is just filled with layers and layers of symbolism, and almost every scene is a rabbit hole in itself, leading to numerous theories. The fact that even after 14 years since the release, people still talk and analyze this film proves just how iconic and significant this movie really is. Thank you guys for watching. What are your thoughts about Prometheus, and is there any details that I've missed? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to join the Patreon for extra support. Also, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel for more content. My name is Croft, and I'll see you in the next video.